Pretend you don't know her. Daniel Brooks said it so quietly the valet almost missed it, but Evelyn Carter heard every word through the cold Manhattan rain. She stood beneath the glowing awning of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, water dripping from the ends of her blonde hair onto the sleeves of her black wool coat, while guests in diamonds and tailored tuxedos brushed past her like she was invisible. 3 years ago, they used to call her the woman behind Brooks Technologies. Tonight, security looked at her like she didn't belong near the front entrance. The city shimmered around her in silver reflections. Black SUVs lined the curb. Camera flashes exploded against marble columns. Somewhere inside the ballroom, a string quartet played soft jazz while executives celebrated the company's 10th anniversary. The company she helped build from a one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and unpaid electric bills. Evelyn tightened her fingers around the invitation in her hand. The thick, cream-colored envelope was already damp from the rain. She almost turned around. Almost. Then she heard Daniel laughing inside. That laugh used to calm her after 18-hour workdays and overdue rent notices. Now it sounded polished. Expensive. Empty. The revolving doors spun open and Daniel stepped outside beside his fiancée, Vanessa Sinclair, a social media celebrity wrapped in white fur and diamonds that sparkled under the hotel lights. Vanessa stopped the moment she saw Evelyn standing there. Her lips curved slowly. "Oh my God," she said softly, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I thought security handled this already." Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes moved over Evelyn's simple black dress, the one she bought on clearance 2 winters ago for her bookstore's holiday dinner. For a second, something flickered across his face. Guilt maybe, or memory, but it vanished the moment Vanessa touched his arm. "You shouldn't be here, Evelyn," he said calmly. Not cruelly. Somehow that made it worse. Behind him, warm golden lights spilled from the ballroom onto the wet sidewalk. She could smell champagne and perfume mixing with the rain. "I received an invitation," Evelyn replied. Quietly, Vanessa laughed under her breath. Probably out of pity. Daniel glanced toward the entrance as several board members approached. The moment he noticed them watching, his posture changed instantly. Colder. Straighter. More careful. "This is a private executive event," he said. "Let's not make this uncomfortable." Evelyn felt her throat tighten, but her face remained still. That was the strange thing about heartbreak. Eventually, the tears stopped showing up. Only the silence remains. One of the security guards stepped closer. Not aggressive, just enough to remind her she no longer belonged there. Around them, conversations softened. People were watching now, waiting. Evelyn slowly lowered her eyes toward the marble floor, where raindrops gathered around the heels of her shoes. She remembered standing beside Daniel 10 years earlier in a tiny kitchen in Queens while he promised, "When we make it together." But success had changed the way he looked at her. Somewhere between private jets and magazine covers, she became an embarrassment he wanted edited out of the story. Vanessa leaned closer to Daniel and whispered something that made both of them smile. Evelyn inhaled slowly and stepped backward toward the rain. Then suddenly the entire entrance fell silent. Valets straightened instantly. Executives stopped talking mid-sentence. Even Daniel turned around. A black Rolls-Royce Phantom had just pulled to the curb. The driver hurried to open the rear door as an elderly man stepped out beneath the city lights, holding a silver cane in one hand. Theodore Whitmore, founder of the Whitmore Empire. One of the richest men in America. Daniel's face lost all color. Because instead of walking toward the ballroom, Theodore Whitmore lifted his eyes directly toward Evelyn standing alone in the rain, and smiled like he'd been looking for her all night. The rain kept falling across Lexington Avenue, turning the streets of Manhattan into rivers of silver light, while every executive near the hotel entrance stood perfectly still. Theodore Whitmore rarely appeared in public anymore. Most people only saw his face on magazine covers beside numbers large enough to buy islands and skyscrapers. Yet tonight, the 80-year-old billionaire ignored the board members rushing toward him and looked only at Evelyn. The city noise seemed to disappear around her. She felt Daniel staring beside Vanessa, confused and tense, as Theodore slowly approached with his silver cane tapping softly against the marble sidewalk. Up close, he looked older than she remembered. Friendlier too. But his sharp blue eyes still carried the same calm intelligence she had seen every Saturday morning inside her little bookstore cafe in Brooklyn. Nobody here knew that part. Nobody knew the most powerful man in the room used to sit beside the window with a cup of dark roast coffee and read Hemingway for hours while soft jazz played through dusty speakers. To everyone else, Theodore Whitmore was a legend. To Evelyn, he was simply the quiet older gentleman who always tipped too much and asked thoughtful questions about books. "You came," Theodore said warmly. Evelyn blinked in surprise. "You invited me." A faint smile touched his face. "Yes, I did." Around them, whispers spread quickly through the crowd. Daniel's fiancée looked completely lost now. She leaned toward him and whispered something urgently, but Daniel could not take his eyes off Evelyn. Theodore Whitmore knew her. Personally, that fact alone changed the air around them. The billionaire turned slightly toward the security guard who had blocked Evelyn minutes earlier. "Next time Miss Carter arrives," Theodore said calmly, "you open the door immediately." The guard nodded so fast he nearly stumbled. Daniel swallowed hard. Evelyn noticed it. For the first time all night, he looked uncertain. Theodore extended his arm politely. "Walk with me." The ballroom doors opened at once. Warm light spilled over them as hundreds of guests inside straightened instinctively. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above black marble floors polished so perfectly they reflected every movement like water. Waiters carrying champagne trays paused mid-step when Theodore entered beside Evelyn. Conversations died one by one until the entire room became silent enough to hear the piano near the stage. Evelyn could feel eyes following her. Everywhere. An hour ago, she had been standing alone in the rain. Now people who once ignored her suddenly moved aside to let her pass. Daniel and Vanessa followed several feet behind, but the power in the room had already shifted. Theodore guided Evelyn toward the front of the ballroom where executives and investors gathered beneath enormous gold banners celebrating Brooks Technologies. She noticed Daniel's company logo projected across giant screens beside the words 10 years of innovation. 10 years. Evelyn remembered all of them. The unpaid credit cards. The nights Daniel slept beside his laptop while she stayed awake proofreading investor emails. The tiny apartment kitchen where she learned bookkeeping because they could not afford an accountant. She even remembered the winter they could only afford one space heater, so she wrapped herself in blankets while helping Daniel rehearse presentations at 2 in the morning. Nobody in this ballroom knew those stories. Success had erased her from the picture. Theodore seemed to notice the sadness crossing her face. He leaned closer and said quietly, "Funny how quickly the world changes when money enters the room." Evelyn looked toward Daniel. He was laughing nervously now while shaking hands with board members, pretending everything was normal. But his eyes kept drifting back toward her. Theodore followed her gaze. "He underestimated you," he said softly. Evelyn lowered her eyes. "Most people do." Theodore smiled again, but this time there was something deeper behind it. Almost regret. Almost certainty. Then the ballroom lights dimmed slightly as a man in a dark navy suit stepped onto the stage holding a sealed black envelope with the Whitmore family crest pressed into red wax. And suddenly, every person in the room turned toward Theodore Whitmore. The man holding the black envelope adjusted his glasses beneath the ballroom lights while hundreds of wealthy guests watched in complete silence. Evelyn stood beside Theodore Whitmore near the front of the stage, still feeling the cold rain lingering against her skin despite the warmth inside the room. Somewhere behind her, crystal glasses clinked softly as nervous whispers moved through the crowd like wind through leaves. Daniel remained frozen near the center of the ballroom, his hand still resting around a champagne glass he had not touched in several minutes. Evelyn noticed the tension in his jaw immediately. He was trying to understand how she had gone from being turned away at the entrance to standing beside the most powerful man in the building. Theodore rested both hands calmly over the silver handle of his cane and looked toward the stage. "Tonight," the man with the envelope announced, "we celebrate not only 10 years of Brooks Technologies, but also the future partnership between Brooks Technologies and Whitmore Holdings." A wave of polite applause filled the room. Daniel forced a confident smile and nodded toward investors nearby, slipping back into the version of himself the public adored. Charming, controlled, untouchable. Evelyn remembered that version well. It used to fool her too. The speaker continued reading corporate achievements while giant screens behind the stage displayed images of Daniel shaking hands with politicians, ringing the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange, and smiling beneath headlines calling him one of America's most visionary entrepreneurs under 40. Not one image included Evelyn. Not one mention of the years she spent helping him survive before success arrived. Theodore leaned slightly toward her. Funny thing about history, he murmured quietly. The people who build the foundation rarely appear in the photographs. Evelyn kept her eyes on the stage. I stopped expecting credit a long time ago. Theodore studied her face carefully after she said it. Not pity, respect. Then suddenly the ballroom doors opened again. A younger man entered wearing a dark charcoal suit with reins still glistening across his shoulders. Tall, calm, sharp blue eyes almost identical to Theodore's. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Several executives straightened at once. Others lowered their voices. Daniel looked visibly uncomfortable now. Evelyn recognized the man instantly from business magazines and financial interviews. Adrian Whitmore, Theodore's only son. The future heir everyone in America expected. To inherit the Whitmore empire someday. Adrian approached his father first. Then his eyes moved toward Evelyn. Unlike Daniel, he did not look surprised to see her standing there. He looked relieved. I thought you might leave before we found you, Adrian said gently. Evelyn blinked. Found me. Theodore gave a faint smile, but said nothing. Adrian extended his hand politely. It is good to finally meet you properly, Miss Carter. Nearby conversation stopped again. Daniel was staring openly now. Vanessa leaned toward him and whispered, Why are they talking to her like that? But Daniel did not answer. Evelyn could almost see the calculations happening behind his eyes. He was replaying every moment from the last 10 minutes, trying to figure out what he had missed. Theodore suddenly looked tired beneath the ballroom lights. Older than before. Adrian noticed it too and quietly steadied his father's arm. You should sit down, he said softly. Theodore shook his head once. Not yet. Then he looked directly at Evelyn again. There are some truths, he said slowly, that deserve witnesses. The man with the envelope stepped away from the podium and approached Theodore with careful respect. Every camera in the ballroom turned toward them. The black envelope changed hands. Theodore held it for several seconds before extending it toward Adrian instead. A ripple of anticipation moved through the room because everyone believed they already knew what was coming next, Daniel included. The future of the Whitmore empire was standing right there in front of them. Adrian accepted the envelope but did not open it. Instead, he turned toward Evelyn with an expression so serious it made her pulse quicken. Then, quietly enough that only she could hear, he said, My father trusted you long before any of us understood why. The ballroom remained silent for several long seconds after Adrian Whitmore spoke those words to Evelyn. Around them, investors and executives exchanged quiet looks filled with confusion and curiosity. Nobody understood why the Whitmore family was treating a woman like Evelyn Carter with such unusual respect. Daniel certainly did not. He stood near the stage, pretending to speak with shareholders, but his attention never left her face. Evelyn could feel it every time she lifted her eyes. The same man who once acted embarrassed by her existence was now desperately trying to understand her value. Adrian finally broke the silence by opening the black envelope carefully beneath the chandelier light. Every movement felt deliberate, controlled, important. Theodore Whitmore remained beside Evelyn, one hand resting lightly against his cane, while the orchestra near the ballroom wall lowered their instruments completely. Nobody in the room wanted to miss a single word. Adrian removed several folded documents from the envelope and glanced at them briefly before looking toward the crowd. Before tonight's partnership announcement, he said calmly, My father requested that a personal statement be shared first. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Vanessa crossed her arms beside him, visibly annoyed that the spotlight had moved away from them. Adrian unfolded the first page. There are people who enter your life when you are building success, he began slowly. And there are people who stay beside you before success exists at all. The room stayed completely still. Evelyn felt something tighten in her chest because the words sounded painfully familiar. Adrian continued reading. One kind celebrates your victories. The other survives your failures with you. Learn the difference carefully. Daniel lowered his champagne glass. Evelyn noticed the color slowly draining from his face again. Theodore turned his head slightly toward her. You know why I like your bookstore so much? He asked quietly. Evelyn blinked in surprise at the sudden question. Theodore smiled faintly. Because nobody there cared who I was. Her mind drifted instantly back to those quiet mornings in Brooklyn. Theodore sitting near the fogged cafe windows in a gray wool coat, turning pages slowly while snowfall covered the sidewalks outside. At the time, Evelyn had no idea he owned half the skyline of Manhattan. He never arrived with security, never demanded attention. He simply listened whenever she spoke about books or life or loneliness, especially loneliness. Most wealthy people, Theodore continued softly, spend their lives wondering if anyone would still see them without the money. Evelyn looked toward him carefully. For the first time since arriving, she noticed exhaustion behind his eyes. Not physical exhaustion, something deeper. The loneliness of a man surrounded by power, but uncertain whom he could trust. Adrian resumed reading. 3 years ago, I entered a small bookstore cafe during a difficult period in my life. The owner did not recognize my name. She only recognized that an old man looked tired. A ripple of whispers spread through the ballroom. Several board members glanced toward Evelyn in disbelief. Adrian looked up from the paper directly at her before continuing. She offered kindness without expecting advantage, integrity without performance, dignity without audience. Daniel stared openly now. Evelyn could almost hear memories crashing into him all at once. Every time he mocked her quiet life after the divorce. Every time he called the bookstore a waste of potential. Every time he told her she lacked ambition because she no longer cared about wealth or status. Theodore's voice interrupted the silence gently. You built a peaceful life after he broke your heart. Evelyn lowered her eyes toward the polished marble floor. I tried. Theodore nodded once. Most people become bitter. You became calm. Across the ballroom, Daniel suddenly took a step forward as if preparing to approach them, but Adrian's next sentence stopped him cold. My father asked that the remaining contents of this envelope be revealed at midnight sharp. The giant clock above the ballroom entrance showed 11:38. 22 minutes remained, and for the first time all evening, fear appeared clearly in Daniel Brooks's eyes. The clock above the ballroom entrance moved louder than before. 11:39, then 11:40. Every minute seemed to tighten the tension spreading through the Whitmore Grand Hotel like invisible smoke. Guests tried returning to conversations, but nobody truly relaxed again after Adrian announced the final contents of the envelope would be revealed at midnight. Evelyn could feel curiosity surrounding her from every direction now. People who had ignored her earlier suddenly smiled politely whenever she passed. A woman in diamonds who once laughed beside Vanessa now offered her champagne with nervous kindness. It amazed Evelyn how quickly respect appeared once powerful people decided you mattered. Theodore noticed it too. Never confuse admiration with loyalty, he said quietly while watching the room. Most people only bow toward light. Evelyn accepted a glass of sparkling water from a waiter and glanced toward the towering windows overlooking Manhattan. Rain still streaked across the city skyline in silver lines, while traffic crawled far below like glowing rivers. Why are you doing this? She finally asked softly. Theodore looked at her for several seconds before answering. Because men like Daniel mistake kindness for weakness. Across the ballroom, Daniel was no longer pretending everything was normal. He stood beside several investors speaking too quickly, his forced smile slipping every few seconds. Evelyn remembered that look well. It was the same expression he wore years ago whenever creditors called about unpaid loans. The difference now was that his fear had nothing to do with money. It had to do with uncertainty. Daniel hated uncertainty more than failure itself. Vanessa touched his arm again, visibly irritated. You are letting this woman ruin your night. She whispered sharply enough for Evelyn to catch fragments of the sentence from across the room. Daniel responded quietly, but his eyes kept drifting back toward Evelyn beside Theodore and Adrian. She realized something then. For the first time since their divorce, Daniel no longer controlled the room. Adrian stepped closer beside her holding 2 crystal glasses filled with amber-colored bourbon. My father says you never drink at formal events, he said with a faint smile. Evelyn looked surprised. Your father notices too much. That is how he built an empire. Adrian handed one glass toward Theodore instead. He notices who people are when nobody important is watching. Theodore accepted the drink slowly before turning toward Evelyn again. Do you remember the first thing you said to me? Evelyn frowned slightly, searching her memory. Then suddenly she laughed softly under her breath. You spilled coffee all over one of the bookstore chairs. Theodore smiled. And instead of recognizing my watch or my driver outside, you handed me paper towels and said, Evelyn shook her head, embarrassed. You looked expensive but clumsy. For the first time all evening, Theodore laughed openly. A genuine laugh. Warm. Human. Nearby executives looked stunned seeing the billionaire relaxed enough to laugh with a woman nobody in the room had heard of 20 minutes earlier. Adrian watched them carefully with quiet understanding in his eyes. After that day, Theodore said, I started visiting your bookstore every week. Evelyn lowered her voice. You never told me who you were. Theodore's expression softened. Would you have spoken to me the same way if I had? She thought about it honestly. Probably not. Theodore nodded as if her silence already answered the question. Exactly. The orchestra began playing again near the ballroom stage. Soft piano notes drifting beneath the crystal chandeliers, while waiters carried trays of desserts through the crowd. Yet beneath all the elegance, tension remained sharp enough to feel. Midnight was approaching. 11:49 now. Daniel finally could not tolerate the distance anymore. He set down his champagne glass and started walking directly toward Evelyn. Every step looked careful, measured, like a man approaching something dangerous without understanding why. Vanessa called after him quietly, but he ignored her completely. Theodore noticed immediately. Adrian did too. Evelyn felt her pulse slow strangely instead of quicken. Once upon a time, Daniel Brooks walking toward her would have made her nervous. Tonight, she simply watched him approach through the golden ballroom light, like a chapter of her life arriving too late. Daniel stopped a few feet away from Evelyn beneath the gold chandelier light, while the noise of the ballroom softened around them. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They had once shared tiny apartments, grocery lists, overdue bills, and dreams whispered after midnight. Now they stood, surrounded by billionaires and strangers who suddenly cared about every glance between them. Evelyn noticed Daniel had aged differently than she expected. More polished on the outside, more exhausted underneath. Success had sharpened his features, but hollowed something behind his eyes. You know Theodore Whitmore? He finally asked quietly. Not angry, confused. Evelyn held his gaze calmly. I know the man who likes black coffee and old novels. Daniel let out a short breath, almost laughing from disbelief. Evelyn, do you understand who he is? Before she could answer, Theodore approached slowly beside Adrian. I was hoping she never would, Theodore replied calmly. Daniel straightened instantly. The shift happened automatically, like instinct. Minutes ago, he had spoken to Evelyn as if she were an inconvenience outside the hotel entrance. Now he looked careful with every word. Respectful. Controlled. Theodore noticed it too. Interesting. The older man murmured softly. People become much more polite when they think power is nearby. Daniel swallowed hard. Vanessa finally walked over, her heels clicking sharply across the marble floor. Daniel, she said under her breath. Everyone is staring. She smiled tightly toward Theodore and Adrian before glancing at Evelyn with poorly hidden irritation. This has become quite the reunion. Evelyn remained silent. She had learned long ago that silence unsettled insecure people more than arguments ever could. Adrian checked the giant clock above the ballroom entrance. 11:53. 7 minutes remained until midnight. The entire room seemed aware of it now. Conversations had become fragmented and distracted as guests kept glancing toward the black envelope still resting in Adrian's hand. Investors whispered quietly near the stage. Reporters near the ballroom entrance refreshed their phones constantly, sensing something major was about to happen. Daniel lowered his voice. If this is about the Whitmore partnership, I should probably know what is happening. Theodore studied him carefully before answering. That depends. Daniel frowned slightly. Depends on what? Theodore's eyes moved briefly toward Evelyn. Whether you ever truly understood the value of what you already had. The sentence landed harder than Evelyn expected. Daniel looked away first. Somewhere deep inside her, old memories stirred painfully. Nights she stayed awake editing his presentations while he slept beside stacks of business textbooks. Mornings she rode the subway downtown carrying homemade coffee because they could not afford cafes back then. She remembered the winter she sold her grandmother's necklace to help cover payroll for his first employees. Daniel once cried in her arms after a rejected investor meeting and promised he would never forget what she sacrificed for him. But people often forget promises made before money arrives. Vanessa folded her arms impatiently. I still do not understand why we are acting like she matters in all of this. The sentence slipped out before she could stop herself. The silence afterward felt immediate and sharp. Daniel closed his eyes briefly in frustration. Adrian looked toward Vanessa with cool politeness. Miss Carter matters because my father says she does. Vanessa forced a nervous smile. I did not mean anything disrespectful. Theodore tilted his head slightly. Disrespect rarely announces itself honestly. Nearby executives suddenly pretended not to listen even though every single person clearly was. Evelyn noticed Daniel becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Not because of public embarrassment. Because for the first time in years, he had lost control of the narrative surrounding his own life. Theodore turned toward Evelyn again. Tell me, he said softly, are you happy? The question surprised her. After everything happening around them, it felt strangely personal. Evelyn thought carefully before answering. Not all the time, she admitted. But peaceful. Yes. Theodore smiled faintly. Peace is more expensive than luxury. Most wealthy people never learn that. The ballroom clock shifted again. 11:58. A hush moved through the crowd as Adrian stepped closer to the stage holding the envelope firmly now. Reporters lifted cameras. Executives straightened their jackets nervously. Daniel stared at the envelope like a man watching a storm. Move closer across open water. Then Theodore looked directly at Evelyn one last time before midnight and said quietly enough that only she could hear, whatever happens next, do not shrink yourself for anyone ever again. The final minute before midnight felt heavier than the entire evening combined. Nobody in the ballroom pretended to socialize anymore. Conversations had completely disappeared beneath the soft sound of piano music drifting through the Whitmore Grand Hotel. Crystal chandeliers glowed above hundreds of silent guests, while rain continued sliding down the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan. Evelyn stood beside Theodore and Adrian near the stage, calm on the outside even as her pulse moved steadily beneath the sleeve of her black dress. Across the room, Daniel looked trapped between fear and disbelief. He kept glancing toward the giant clock above the ballroom entrance, as if somehow the next 60 seconds could still be stopped. 11:59. The second hand moved slowly, deliberately. Adrian stepped onto the stage holding the black envelope in one hand, while cameras immediately lifted throughout the ballroom. Reporters near the back moved closer. Several executives exchanged nervous looks because none of them had expected the Whitmore family to dominate the evening this completely. Theodore remained standing beside Evelyn despite Adrian quietly urging him to sit earlier. The older billionaire's expression had become almost reflective now, like a man finally prepared to put down something heavy he had carried for years. Then midnight arrived. The clock chimed once. Adrian opened the envelope fully beneath the ballroom lights and unfolded the final document. The room became silent enough to hear glasses being set down across the marble tables. Adrian looked toward the audience first. This statement, he announced calmly, contains the final personal directive of Theodore Whitmore regarding Whitmore Holdings and all controlling assets connected to the Whitmore family estate. A wave of tension swept visibly through the room. Investors straightened instantly. Board members exchanged shocked looks. Daniel's face tightened because everyone already assumed what came next. Adrian Whitmore would officially become heir to one of the largest financial empires in America. Theodore looked toward Evelyn quietly. Watch carefully, he murmured. Adrian continued reading. For most of my life, I believed intelligence built great companies. Experience built wealth. Discipline built power. He paused briefly. But I learned too late that character is the rarest thing a person can possess once money enters the room. Nobody moved. Nobody even whispered anymore. Adrian lowered his eyes toward the document again. 3 years ago, I met a woman who had already lost almost everything society told her mattered. Marriage, status, recognition. Yet somehow she remained kind. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. Daniel slowly turned toward her again, realization beginning to spread visibly across his face now. Adrian continued. She expected nothing from me because she did not know my name. She treated me with dignity before she knew my influence. And in a world filled with people desperate to impress wealth, she reminded me what integrity actually looks like. Vanessa looked completely pale now. Several board members were openly staring at Evelyn in shock. Theodore's voice suddenly interrupted softly beside her. Do not be afraid. Evelyn looked at him quickly. I am not afraid. A faint smile touched his face. Good. Adrian lifted the final page carefully. Effective immediately upon my father's retirement from active leadership, the controlling ownership shares of Whitmore Holdings, including all majority decision-making authority connected to the Whitmore Global Estate, will be transferred to. Daniel took one unconscious step forward. The ballroom seemed to stop breathing entirely. Adrian looked directly toward Evelyn. Miss Evelyn Carter. Silence. Absolute silence. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, a champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered against marble. Vanessa covered her mouth in disbelief. Several executives immediately began whispering frantically while reporters raised cameras, so quickly flashes exploded across the room like lightning. Daniel stood completely motionless. His face had gone almost colorless beneath the chandelier light. Evelyn herself could not move for several seconds. She stared at Adrian as though she had misunderstood the words completely. But Theodore simply looked at her calmly, like this moment had already existed in his mind long before tonight. Then Adrian stepped down from the stage, walked directly toward Evelyn in front of the entire ballroom, and placed the black envelope gently into her hands. The weight of the black envelope felt unreal in Evelyn's hands. Around her, camera flashes burst non-stop across the ballroom, while reporters whispered urgently into phones and executives spoke over one another in stunned disbelief. Only an hour earlier, she had been standing alone outside in the rain, while security looked ready to escort her away. Now the most powerful people in the room could not stop staring at her. Theodore Whitmore watched the chaos quietly beside her with the calm expression of a man who had already accepted every consequence of his decision. Adrian remained at Evelyn's side like a shield against the storm exploding around them. Daniel still had not moved. He stood frozen beneath the chandelier light, his eyes fixed entirely on the envelope in Evelyn's hands. Not on Theodore. Not on Adrian. On her. As though he was finally seeing her clearly for the first time in years. Vanessa broke the silence first. This has to be some kind of mistake. Her voice sounded thin beneath the tension filling the ballroom. Several people turned toward her immediately. Adrian answered before anyone else could. Whitmore legal counsel prepared every document personally. Vanessa forced a nervous laugh. You are telling me this woman suddenly owns Whitmore Holdings? The phrase "this woman" hung in the air awkwardly. Evelyn noticed several executives shift uncomfortably at the disrespect in Vanessa's tone. Theodore slowly turned his eyes toward her. No, he said calmly. I am saying she earned my trust long before tonight. The sentence silenced the room again. Daniel finally stepped forward. His voice came out lower than usual. Evelyn. She looked at him quietly. He opened his mouth, then stopped. For once, Daniel Brooks did not seem to know how to speak. Evelyn realized something strange in that moment. She had imagined this kind of reversal before during lonely nights after the divorce. She imagined him regretting everything. Imagined him shocked. Speechless. But standing here now, she did not feel victorious. She felt distant. Like she was watching an old life from across a river she no longer needed to cross. Adrian gently took the envelope from her hands and opened it again. There is one final directive, he announced clearly enough for the room to hear. Every voice stopped immediately. Adrian removed another document and continued reading. Effective immediately, all executive partnerships involving Brooks Technologies will remain active under Whitmore Holdings review. Daniel's face tightened. He understood corporate language instantly. Evelyn could see it happen in real time. Brooks Technologies no longer stood beside Whitmore Holdings as an equal partner. It now answered to Whitmore Authority. And Whitmore Authority belonged to Evelyn. A ripple of whispers spread violently across the ballroom. Several investors looked directly toward Daniel now, calculating consequences already. Vanessa stared at him in panic. Daniel, what does that mean? He did not answer her. Because he already knew. Every expansion plan, every merger, every international contract Brooks Technologies depended on now passed through Evelyn Carter. The same woman he once called emotionally weak for opening a bookstore instead of chasing status beside him. Theodore stepped closer to Evelyn slowly. Power reveals people, he said quietly. But losing power reveals them faster. Daniel lowered his eyes for several seconds before finally speaking again. I never knew, he admitted softly. Evelyn's expression remained calm. You never asked. The sentence landed harder than anger would have. Nearby reporters immediately began typing notes into phones, while flashes reflected across the marble floors like lightning. Daniel looked devastated now in a way Evelyn had never seen before. Not because of money, not because of business, because for the first time he understood exactly what he had thrown away years ago when success convinced him he had outgrown her. Theodore suddenly looked tired again. Adrian gently steadied his father's arm, while executives nearby instinctively moved aside for them. Before leaving, Theodore looked back toward Evelyn one final time. "Do not let this world harden you," he said softly. "The reason I trusted you is because wealth never changed your heart before you had it." Then the billionaire everyone feared and admired nodded respectfully toward her in front of the entire ballroom. And one by one, the executives surrounding them slowly began doing the same. By 1 o'clock in the morning, the ballroom had transformed completely. Reporters crowded near the marble staircase hoping for statements, while executives who once ignored Evelyn now waited patiently just for a moment of her attention. The same people who had looked through her earlier were suddenly calling her Miss Carter with careful respect. It would have felt satisfying once. Instead, it only made her tired. Theodore Whitmore had already been escorted upstairs to rest after the announcement, leaving Adrian to manage the chaos surrounding the transfer of power. Through it all, Evelyn remained strangely calm. She stood near the enormous windows overlooking Manhattan, watching rain slide across the glass while the city lights shimmered below like scattered gold. She remembered nights years ago when she and Daniel shared dollar pizza slices on subway platforms because they could not afford dinner after paying rent. Back then they used to stare at the skyline together and promise each other they would someday belong inside buildings like this. The strange part was that she finally did belong there now. But Daniel no longer belonged beside her. "Evelyn." His voice came quietly from behind her. She turned slowly. Daniel stood alone this time, without Vanessa, without investors, without the polished confidence he carried all evening. Just Daniel. Older, regretful, human again. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The city reflected across the window behind her, while soft piano music drifted faintly through the nearly empty ballroom. Daniel looked down briefly before meeting her eyes. "Again, I do not even know what to say." Evelyn studied him carefully. Once, she would have done anything to hear uncertainty in his voice because it would have meant he still cared. Tonight, it only sounded late. "You do not have to say anything," she answered gently. Daniel let out a slow breath. "I was awful to you." She remained silent, because denying it would have been dishonest. Daniel rubbed one hand across his jaw tiredly. "After the company started growing, I convinced myself I needed a different life, different people around me. I thought ambition meant leaving behind anything that reminded me of struggle." Evelyn looked toward the city again. "Including me." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "Yes." The honesty in his answer hurt less than she expected. Maybe because the wound had already healed long ago without him noticing. "I kept thinking success would finally make me happy," he admitted quietly. "But somewhere along the way, I became someone I barely recognize." Evelyn remembered the young man who once slept beside business plans spread across a tiny kitchen table. The man who kissed her forehead after failed investor meetings and promised they would survive everything together. That version of Daniel had existed once. But ambition had slowly carved him into someone colder. Someone who confused admiration with love. Daniel looked at her carefully now, almost like he was searching for the woman he lost years ago. "Did you ever hate me?" he asked softly. Evelyn thought about it honestly. The divorce papers. The loneliness. Watching him erase her from his success story. She had carried anger for a long time. But anger eventually exhausts itself when one person keeps growing and the other keeps pretending nothing happened. "No," she finally answered. "I just stopped shrinking myself for people who could not see my worth." Daniel lowered his eyes immediately. The sentence landed with quiet finality between them. No screaming. No revenge. Just truth. Adrian approached from across the ballroom then, pausing respectfully a few feet away. "The car is ready whenever you are," he said gently to Evelyn. Daniel glanced toward him and seemed to realize all over again that this new world around Evelyn was real. Permanent. Beyond his reach now. Evelyn nodded softly and picked up the black envelope resting beside her chair. The envelope that changed everything. As she walked past Daniel, he turned slightly like he wanted to stop her, to apologize again, maybe even ask for another chance. But he did not. Deep down, he understood some doors closed quietly forever. Evelyn paused only once beside him. "You once told me I did not belong in rooms like this," she said softly. Daniel could not even look at her. Evelyn smiled faintly, not cruelly, just peacefully. "Turns out I was never too small for the room. You were just too blind to see me." Then she walked away beneath the golden chandelier light while executives stepped aside respectfully in silence. And somewhere above the sleeping Manhattan skyline, the first clear stars of the night finally appeared after the storm.